Hello, my name is Chris Marchioli, and I'm an Executive Director with Waystone in New York. I'd like to thank everyone for joining our webinar today, where we will be covering recent developments related to FATCA CRS reporting in the Cayman Islands. Today, I'll be joined by my colleague, Roman Ifling, who is a Managing Director in our Regulatory Compliance Services Group. Roman has been with Waystone for over 7 years, and before joining Waystone, Roman was Head of Tax Compliance at KPMG in Cayman, and has also worked with several asset managers during his career. For those of you who aren't familiar with Waystone, we're a global governance, risk, and compliance firm that has supported the asset management industry for over 20 years. We have over 600 employees spread across 9 offices, where we provide services to Europe, the Middle East, Asia Pacific, and also here in the US. We support investment structures and strategies worldwide with over 1 trillion in assets under management overall. Today, we will be reviewing key FATCA and CRS requirements and deadlines for the Cayman Islands, and also recent CRS enforcement guidelines issued by the Cayman Tax Information Authority. We will also touch on Cayman tax portal updates and cover 2021 reportable jurisdictions. Lastly, we'll speak about ways we're able to help investment managers ensure that they are meeting the many FATCA and CRS requirements in the Cayman Islands. Roman, before we get into the enforcement guidelines that are getting a lot of attention, would you be able to provide an overview of the key FATCA CRS requirements and deadlines?
Sure, thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. Yeah, FATCA and CRS have been around now for some time. Most of you know these are automatic exchange of information regimes where jurisdictions share information about investors, account holders, so that they declare their investments in their local jurisdiction in a tax return to ensure that the tax system have their integrity and there's no tax evasion. We have US FATCA, which looks at US investors, if any US investors or citizens have invested in a fund. And similarly, the common reporting standard applies to all the investors in an entity, and you determine if they are a tax resident in one of the participating jurisdictions. The entities have to do then an annual filing for FATCA and CRS. For CRS, it's a mandatory filing. So even if you have no reportable investors, you have to submit a report to the authorities in Cayman, certifying that there are no reportable accounts. For US FATCA, it's not mandatory if you don't have any US investors, but we always advise that you file a report to demonstrate to the authorities you have done your due diligence, you have done your filings, and those filings are due July 31st of 2022 for the 2021 reporting cycle. If you are a new manager, you need to consider, if it's the first time around that you do this filing, you have to talk to your service provider, to your administrator, and see if everything is in place, if you have reviewed the classifications and things like this. And that's also something where Waystone can assist you. In addition to the traditional US FATCA and CRS report, the Cayman Islands has something in addition, the CRS compliance form. This was introduced in 2020. And really, the OECD and the participating jurisdictions wanted that the Cayman Islands collect a little bit more data from the market participants, because Cayman doesn't have a tax system. So there's a limitation on the data points that they can collect. So the CRS compliance form is a filing that's due September 15th. And it asks additional questions. So it looks at the financial data information about the entity. Is it registered with CIMA? If it's not registered with CIMA, who is performing the KYC and AML reviews? And then also if there are financial statements available. But the two main sections are really focusing on non-reportable investors. So on the one hand, you submit the data of the reportable investors, but the authorities want to know also what are the investor base made up of the non-reporting investors. So you have different buckets, like for example, US investors, FI investors. So you have to classify your investors then in these additional buckets so that the authorities have then an idea what is the population of reportable investors and what is the population of non-reportable investors. They have the total NAV size. And this enables them also then to have like an audit tool where they will be able to, and they have some criteria and can then choose who to select for an audit or an examination. So that's one of the purposes of this form.
Thanks, Roman. It sounds like whoever is overseeing this role really should have a good understanding of the regulations in Cayman. It's really important. Regarding the enforcement guidelines that have been getting a lot of attention, can you provide an overview of what they are and what the drivers might be? Why did the tax authority in Cayman release these earlier this year?
So yeah, like you said, these were issued March 31st of this year. And these are now setting out the enforcement action and administrative penalties under the CRS regulation. So before, if someone asked, what is the applicable penalty if we miss a report, that was hard to say because there was no clear information what the penalty would be. But now with the issuance of this enforcement guidelines, we have a clear idea of what the penalties will be. And the authorities had to demonstrate also that Cayman Islands did not only said they implemented the common reporting standard, so they now also have tools to enforce them. So if a report is missing, there will be a penalty. And so this is a tool to really ensure compliance of the participants with the common reporting standard. And maybe it's a good idea to have a look at some examples, what the authorities consider to be an offense under these guidelines. So there's a specific definition, for example, of undocumented accounts. So you should be clear what you submit if the investor is really undocumented or not. Otherwise, if you do an incorrect submission, then that could trigger a penalty. Maybe we take some of the obvious one, the failure to submit a CRS declaration or a compliance form. So these are, if you miss to file a report, there will be now a penalty assessed. Not so obvious one, but we have seen in the past that investment managers were not clear on the classification and got a notice from the authorities asking if this entity should not have a GIN or if the registration is correct like this. So there will be also now penalties if an entity is not classified correctly on the portal, or if you're missing the information of the authorizing person or the principal point of contact. So this will carry now also a penalty. So you have to review the setup on the portal to ensure that all the necessary information is correctly set up in the portal. And then with respect to incorrect reports, so if reportable accounts are missing, which is later detected in an examination, that can trigger a penalty. Or if you fail to submit certain data points like the tax identification number or date of birth. So you have to really review before you file that all the required data points are contained in the XML file that's submitted to the authorities.
Thanks, Roman. And
then, yeah, go ahead.
Would you say, have we heard of any penalties being enforced yet, or what would the timeline be for this? I think we had a few questions about that already.
Actually, we today saw the first notice issued or the first penalty issued for not registering the entity by the deadline. So when I mentioned there's July 31st as a reporting deadline, Cayman has also a registration deadline when you have to register a new entity by, which is April 30th, that's passed. So, and you see now on the screen the details about the offenses and the penalties that give you a better understanding what the penalty is carrying for the different offenses. And the failure to register on the portal is 37,500 Cayman dollars. So all these amounts are in Cayman dollar, and the Cayman dollar is roughly 20% more than the US dollar. So it's a hefty penalty. And so, yeah, as I said, today we had seen that, or we were contacted by someone that had received the notice, and they are now seeing what they can do with this penalty. But also interesting, if you look at the different penalties, and they're very detailed, as we said before, in the CRS compliance form, they're asking also about the policies and procedures, that you have CRS policies and procedures for the entity. So you can have policies and procedures of your administrator, but these should be entity specific. They should address how the fund oversees the CRS compliance process, who is involved, who approves filing, who makes the filings. And you see a failure to establish and maintain written policies and procedure as the first point can carry up to 7,500 Cayman dollars. Then also the failure to implement and comply with the policies and procedures, the same penalty. And so they are separate offenses. And then also to establish and maintain these written policies and procedures. So when we prepare them and send them to the board of directors, we always recommend them to ratify those policies and procedures so that it's documented in the notes, in the minutes. If later there should be any question or an examination, you can point to this ratification. But then you see also if you fail to submit a CRS return, it's $5,000. If you don't submit a nil report or provide any other information, $10,000. So it can add up, and shows you also the different areas where the authority really focus on, that they want to ensure that everyone is following the processes and the policies that are set out by the common reporting standards.
Well, thanks, Roman. That's really helpful. I mean, this is clearly something that should be on everyone's radar. The tax authority, has been tasked with not only creating the regulations, but enforcing them, and they need to show that to the global regulators, and that's why this is so important. Now, you mentioned some of these data points that you mentioned are maintained in the portal. I was wondering if you could cover a little bit about, what's new in the portal, and specifically cover the deactivation. That's a new feature there that everyone needs to be paying attention to.
Yeah, so the deactivation function was available beginning of this year, and it was really important that you review any liquidating entities that are no longer active, that you deregister them from the portal, so you have no ongoing filing requirements. As we saw, if you are registered on the portal, then the authorities will assume that you have a filing requirement, and if you don't file, you could be subject to penalties. So this is a new feature. What you have to do is you provide some information when the entity ceased to exist. You have to attach the certificate of dissolution or whatever you have on hand, for example, in the SPC, the resolution to terminate a cell. And then you also have to provide the information who will maintain the records of the entities for the next 6 years. And then that request is submitted via the portal. So similar to a filing, it will be sent to the authorities, and then they review the deactivation and either come back with questions. They would then deny the request of termination and ask to attach different documents, or you have to be also sure that you filed all your returns that are outstanding. And there's also a little difference in FATCA and CRS. So it's really important that, for example, if all the investors left, let's say December 31st of 2021, but then the liquidation ends in 2022, let's say in March, the entity still has filing obligations for 2022. So it's not enough that you just file the 2021 returns and the CRS compliance form. That's also required. So the CRS declaration and the compliance form, and if you have reportable accounts. But then you also, and you can do that already on the portal, file then also the same returns for 2022, the declaration and the CRS compliance form. And only if that has been completed, then the authority will deactivate the entity from the portal, and there are no further filing requirements and no potential penalties.
Well, thanks, Roman. So it seems like there's a lot more responsibility given now to the principal point of contact and the AEOI delegate in maintaining this information. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we can help with that if any of our audience aren't comfortable filling that role, because we do see people from the management side being appointed to those roles. And clearly this is getting so complicated now that it might be a good idea for many to look to experts to be appointed to these roles. How about the 2021 CRS reportable jurisdictions, Roman? Anything of note here?
It's always important before the filings are due to review if there are additional jurisdictions added, or sometimes they drop off. And for the 2021 reporting cycle, you see here on the slide, so Jamaica, Kenya, Morocco have been added. So you maybe have investors in those jurisdictions. So the review needs to include these jurisdictions as well, because you might have to file there. And Kuwait has been removed from the list as reportable jurisdiction. So if you have investors that were tax resident in Kuwait, then you don't have to report them. But it is important to have it also in your policies and procedures. So we update them on a regular basis. Maybe we review each quarter, but then if something like this comes up at the beginning of the year, if there are changes to the reportable jurisdictions, we include that so that the policies and procedures are always up to date. And then now one of the big changes was obviously the enforcement guidelines. They have been included in the policies as well, so that also the board is aware what has been changed, what their responsibility is, and that we are all on the same page.
Okay, that's good to know. And that's something else your team has expertise in, right? Keeping up with the reportable jurisdictions and making sure that the investor classifications are reviewed and accurate, which is a very important part of the process. And that kind of leads us to where we can help managers. You know, we have several different ways we can help a manager. You know, we can work alongside your administrator to take over the roles of principal point of contact, AEOI delegate. We can handle the CRS attestations and forms, make the filings, or we also have a full service option where we can actually perform the investor classifications that will be generated by your administrator. So there's definitely several different ways we can help here. We have a customizable solution, and we'll be happy to have a conversation with you about how we might be able to help. Roman, can you think of any other ways, you know, situations where we might be able to help? I know we do other things like procuring GIN numbers, helping with self-certifications, W-8 forms. But what would be the important, you know, pieces that you see most often that managers might need help with?
Like you said, we have a completely customizable service. So it can start as simple as just getting a GIN number or helping with a form to the completely outsourced solution where we oversee the administrator, or in case of a family office or a private equity fund where everything is done in-house, we work then with the internal teams together, help them with the classifications, and then we file the reports and create the necessary filings for them. Maybe also important to say is we provide this service in over 20 jurisdictions. So while Cayman is our biggest part of the portfolio, but also we can help with funds in Ireland, Luxembourg, Singapore, Hong Kong. So that's no problem as well. Important is, you have to be up to date. And like you said, there are constant changes with deadlines, with the additional enforcement guidelines. So it's hard for smaller managers that are new and starting to keep up with all the regulatory compliance issues. So it's good to have someone that can provide an expert service, I would say, that navigates you through these things and helps you with this and takes on the responsibility. So that's one of our distinguishers, that we also take on the responsibilities for these filings. But also, if you have a lot of investors or bigger funds, the investment manager, portfolio manager, or the compliance officer, they might not have the technical knowledge, but for sure, I'm sure they don't have the time to go through everything in detail, to look at the documentation that was obtained, if it's valid, test what the administrator has done. And that's, I think, where we can, where we plug in well We can help them out. We take this on for them. That's what we do on a daily basis. And we work together with the administrator, like you said before, and it can be really as hands-on or hands-off as you like. So we can have regular calls, we can have calls right before the deadline to discuss what has been done, what will be reported. And we also present and on board meetings and prepare reports where we tell the board what is the current situation, are there any outstanding issues, what will be reported, and when the reports have been submitted, so that the board is also aware of what's the current state and what are the next steps for the funds.
Exactly. So really, whoever is handling this now at the manager could really step away from the process and hand it over to an expert firm like Waystone. And I'll just note that we do work with, you know, pretty much every administrator on the planet and have created customizable solutions to fit with their workflows and your workflows to make this, make all of the reporting accurate and make sure it's done on time. So, yeah, you know, we'd love to be able to help. You know, here is a review of some of the points that we can help with. I'm happy to send this to anyone who wants to reach out to us after the call. We're happy to have Roman and I are happy to have a conversation with you and find ways that we might be able to assist. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. If you have any questions, please do reach out to us, and we look forward to hearing from some of you. We did get some questions in that we didn't get to today. I'll respond to those individually. And please don't hesitate to reach out, even if you think your workflow is maybe, you know, is solid enough to make sure you meet the requirements this year at the end of July and in September. We're happy to do a gap analysis or a reality check and make sure that everything is done accurately, especially in light of the fines. It's important that it's done right this year. So thank you very much for attending.